Disclaimer: this program is being recorded and is intended for informational purposes only. Nothing should be taken as legal advice, and any information, question, or discussion should not relate to any client matter that may be considered privileged or confidential. Hello, and welcome to today's program 30 minute essentials flying high in airport restaurants. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box and our presenters will answer it in the Q&A section of the program. And kicking off our program is Riley Lageson. Riley, you're welcome to begin.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody, to our session today. We're going to have a fun and fast-paced 30 minutes or less. Appreciate everybody taking the time to join. My name is Riley Lageson. I chair the restaurant group at Greenberg Traurig, and with me is my colleague, Kyle Lennox, one of the leaders on our franchising team. Next slide, please. I've been looking forward to this session for a long time because I'm a huge fan of airport restaurants. There's nothing better than going on a trip and going to the airport and being able to enjoy a restaurant that you really want to go to. And I would say for those that are under the age of 45, you maybe even don't realize that there was a time when the only food that was usually offered at most airports was out of a vending machine. And up until the 1980s, there were very limited options for travelers. And then in the mid 80s to the early 2000s, we really started to see a transition with a number of different companies beginning to operate in the airport space and offering a variety of different brands. And originally it started with mostly large brands and some of the big franchise businesses where you go to airport, you'd find a Burger King or a Dunkin'. Starbucks really started to make a lot of headway in the late 80s and early 90s. And then around the 2000s, we really started to see more demand from consumers and airports alike for brand differentiation. A lot of different local favorites, as well as national and regional chef-driven brands and a variety of different other food service options. So when you travel today, you'll see pretty much every airport you go to that many have evolved in their food service to provide a wide array of offerings of different food types and styles that contain both local favorites and national brands in a real exciting mix. Next slide, please. So for those that are looking at airport opportunities, and we know that's a topic of great interest to a lot of our clients, how do you find an opportunity to operate a restaurant in an airport? For many, it's a mystery because you walk in and you see all these brands operating, but how do these deals come together? Most deals come together through requests for proposals that are issued by airport authorities. And these RFPs, as they're called, are issued often on a terminal basis, depending upon how long the prior lease or concessions agreement has been in place. And then when that is nearing its end, airport authorities will often issue a new RFP to allow new businesses or incumbents the opportunity to participate in the process. And it's a very competitive and rigorous and time-consuming and often frustrating selection process in which ultimately one or more parties are awarded the right to operate in the airport, whether it's concessions groups that operate one or multiple brands, or there are direct opportunities with operators to operate under a lease or other agreement with the airport. There are also opportunities to get airport restaurants without a RFP. So those are called direct opportunities. Those are far and few between and the exception, not the rule, but those do exist. And it's often possible to develop relationships with those that are operating airport restaurants currently to potentially replace an existing concept or add a new concept, all of which is always subject to the approval of the airport authority. Next slide, please. So there are a number of contractual operating structures, and we're really going to focus on B, licensing/franchising, but there are also opportunities to self-operate, and then there are what are called joint ventures. Self-operation, for that self-explanatory, it's the brand operates its own business in the airport, and that's still a viable and popular option for many, but more gravitate towards licensing, franchising, and joint ventures. That term loosely describes a relationship which is sometimes more like a license or franchise, where a brand may receive a certain profit share off the bottom in exchange for providing its intellectual property and know-how, or there are actually situations where parties both contribute capital and have more of a true joint venture. But for purposes of our brief session today, we're going to focus on B, licensing, franchising. Next slide, please. Airport restaurant operation, very different from operating on the street in street locations. And this is something that's very important for operators to consider and brands to consider, because it's a real specialized skill to successfully operate in airports. And I know we have some terrific operators here on the call with us today whose businesses are dedicated to food service operations at airports and often other non-traditional venues. Because the development and construction costs can differ dramatically, often higher than at street locations. Occupancy costs can also be higher than a typical street location, and the operating expenses can also be considerably higher, especially given the days and times and hours of operation. In addition to what is frequently present are union agreements which require union labor to be involved in the operation, among other things. Next slide, please. So often clients will come, or brands will come to us and say, I'd like to do this deal, and we don't want to franchise, so we're going to structure it as a license. And that always puts a smile on a franchise attorney's face, right, Kyle? Because because they're often the same thing for purposes of the law. So when you're dealing, we're going to talk about three very basic elements of a license / franchise. And in franchise, the term is defined by federal law, and there's a number of state statutes that define a franchise, and basically contains three elements: the right of one party to use the trademark of the other in the operation of its business. That party that owns the trademark exercises some level of significant control or provides some form of substantial assistance to the operator in the business. And the other party must pay the brand owner a payment in exchange for using intellectual property and operating the business under the trademark. So when you have all those present, you're often looking at what is legally recognized as a franchise. And we'll move on to the next slide here. I'm going to ask Kyle, why is this important? Why is the definition of a franchise important to operators and brands alike? Why should they know about it? And specifically, when we're talking about obligations of one who is franchising, we hear the term FDD a lot. What exactly does that mean? And are there circumstances where you can do a transaction with an operator in an airport or elsewhere without all of the requirements that may be required with the FDD that you're going to be talking about?
Thanks, Riley. So basically, franchising is regulated by federal and state laws. Under the federal law, you have to provide a franchise disclosure document, which is a document. It's a sales tool, right? It's a document that contains 23 items that details the franchise opportunity and background information about the franchisor. And that needs to be provided to franchisees prior to entering into any sort of franchise agreement or license agreement, or however it's termed. And you need to do that before you sign the franchise agreement. So that's the general rule of thumb. But under both federal and state laws, there are exemptions to that rule, where certain franchisees or transactions may be exempt from having to go through that disclosure process. And so oftentimes when we're talking about airport operators, you're going to be able to qualify for exemptions. The two most common exemptions under federal law that would apply to airport situations are going to be a fractional franchise exemption and a sophisticated franchisee exemption. So under the fractional franchise exemption, essentially the rule is that if you have 2 years of experience operating a similar business, and that the business that you're signing up for won't be more than 20% of your overall revenue, it's considered a fractional franchise, meaning that it's only a fractional part of the business that you're going to be bringing on as the operator, and therefore you would not be succumb to the federal franchise law. You wouldn't have to go through the disclosure process. The second federal exemption would be the large franchisee exemption. So if you're an operator, you have 5 years of experience, and you have a minimum net worth of over $7.3 million, you would be considered exempt from having to go through the disclosure process. So that's federal, right? But there's still 14 states, we call them registration states, that have franchise laws that you also need an exemption from, depending on where the airport or the franchise is located. And in some of these states, for example, these exemptions wouldn't apply. Two that stick out are New York and Maryland, neither of which has a fractional franchise exemption. And so in those instances, we need to go ahead and work on a sort of a discretionary exemption with the state. We apply for one, and we can still usually get it under the pretenses that you would otherwise qualify for this fractional franchise exemption under federal law. But there's just different nuances to be aware of. And always remember that there's two sort of buckets of law that you need to comply with. One is this overarching federal law that applies to every transaction in the United States. And two are these individual state laws, depending on where the franchise will be located. So there's a lot to navigate before determining whether or not an exemption applies and whether or not you need to provide a prospect with an FDD if you're the franchisor.
Kyle, how do you determine if you're a brand and an operator, you're talking to them and they say, we would love to put you in the airport, and you do not have a FDD and you do not want to go through the process and spend the money to prepare one? How do you determine if an exemption applies? Do you have to do an audit of any type, or what information do you need to rely on the other party?
I mean, you should sort of check the background of the party you're potentially partnering with, because ultimately the franchisee's information or the licensee is what's going to determine whether or not an exemption applies. So there you would ask for financial statements, you do basic background checks, and then you'd ask them to sign representations and warranties in the actual agreement that you're drafting, where they're attesting to the fact that they qualify for these exemptions. And what we advise clients to do is to literally model the exemptions word for word in the agreement, so that there's no ambiguity as to what they're representing to in the actual agreement.
And what happens if you blow through the stop sign and fail to comply? Are there consequences?
Can be. Under federal law, there's civil fines, which again, it has to sort of be repeated behavior. If you do this in a registration state, where you're not registered or where you're not disclosing and complying with that state laws, the state will have remedies that they can bring against you. There's rescission rights, where basically a franchisee can seek to rescind the contract on the basis that you failed to comply with the disclosure law, and then seek their money back. There's even criminal liability that could come of it in the most extreme circumstances. So, that's not to freak anybody out, but it's just to say that, these laws are serious, and that these disclosure requirements are important to understand how to deal with them. But in most circumstances, like if you contact the right person or an attorney that knows what they're doing, they're going to be able to help you through this process and do it efficiently, so that you're not undertaking these costs needlessly.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle. So I think to sum it up, especially with airport operations, more often than not, especially when you're dealing with an experienced, qualified operator, one or more exemptions, are likely to apply. And we, along with the brand, can help screen operators to determine if one or more exemptions is available, and then also if a state requires any filing or other requirements, help meet those obligations.
That's dead on. Yep.
Well, I think we'll move on to the next slide here. And we have an incredible group on this call today, and we want to open it up for questions and comments too. We have some great operators and brands. So obviously we've got a little less than 15 minutes left. So, if you want to chime in with a question, feel free to do so in the Q&A or chat feature. And we'll also be opening it up towards the end to see if anybody has anything they would like to say or ask. But in finding or identifying a licensee or JV operator, there's a few different types. There's the primes, which are the major groups, which are really well known and experienced in operating in airports, very strong and sophisticated companies that have years and years of experience. And then there's a number of what we call boutique operators that are smaller business that are also very experienced in operations. And then I think it's important to touch on ACDBE operators, which are referred to as Airport Concessions Disadvantaged Business Enterprise operators, which are minority or women-owned businesses, and they play an important part in many airport transactions. So many RFPs that have been issued, especially over the last several decades, have called for or required or provided some level of preference to bidding parties where there is a ACDB partner. And sometimes ACDBs are operating by themselves through their own businesses. Sometimes they operate in partnership with others. And so in determining, and we'll go on to the next slide here, who could be the best fit, and in terms of representing your brand if you're a brand owner, and how to talk to potential operators. There's a number of important criteria, and this goes both sides, right? The operators want to know that they're working with brands that are going to help most often win these opportunities or get approval from the airport, and the brand wants the same, because it doesn't make sense for anybody to spend their time if you're not putting your best forward to win. And I'll tell you, these processes are extremely competitive, and some operators on our call today and brands know that full well as well or better than anyone. These are hard opportunities to get. And so parties want to make sure that there's the ability and willingness, to design, develop, and operate the brand, in accordance with brand standards, especially if you're an operator, and if you're talking to somebody and they're not willing to do that, then it's probably not a good fit, probably not a good candidate, assuming your brand standards are important, which is usually the case. It's also in an RFP process that the proposed operator is invested enough in the process to really make a good go at winning the award. Because these processes are very expensive and competitive, sometimes operators will think about entering the process and they'll sign up brands and decide not to go through with it. So if you're a brand and you're signing with somebody that may or may not go through with it, you're going to want to know that and at least negotiate some exceptions and carve outs to exclusivity in the event they don't go through. Also, the financial strength and proven operating experience in airports, to Kyle's point, especially on exemptions and relationships with airport authorities, and the ability to finance and operate the locations, that is also a critical factor. And if you're a brand and you're signing up with somebody, you really want to know if they're going to bid, and then that again goes to the point of understanding how committed they are to the process. What is their experience with that particular airport? Who, if they can reveal what other brands they might be working with in this process, do they have existing operations, and so forth. Next slide, please. And in terms of other key metrics, and I think, Kyle, I think some of the work you do with traditional franchisors, like when you're dealing with a traditional franchise company, you have a whole bunch of different fees, right? You have a set initial fee, a royalty, you're charging marketing fees most often, correct?
That's right.
And in the airport space, it's often a little bit different.
You would typically see potentially a lower royalty rate and either no or a very low marketing rate under an airport agreement. And these franchise agreements that are drafted, they're not drafted for airports, right? So what often happens is franchisors have sort of non-traditional location amendments to the franchise agreements that they'll have in place, where they account for these operational and financial differences between a non-traditional location like an airport and a traditional location that you would see, out on the street.
And that's a really, really great point that Kyle makes, because a lot of franchisors have their set of franchise documents, but they don't fit the airport situation. And over the years, we've created a form of airport agreement that we've worked with operators with that's really conformed to the airport environment, because it is different in the economics and other key provisions. So as Kyle said, you usually don't see separate marketing fees payable by the airport operator. Why? It's a captive audience venue. So if your standard franchise agreement says, 3% of sales need to go towards marketing, that's not really going to benefit the airport operator so much when people are already there, and they're not going to get the benefit of that national advertising or other advertising efforts. So usually it's only going to be a royalty. There may be some incentives that are negotiated. There's typically an initial fee, but it's not necessarily going to be uniform with the standard franchise agreement. Also, as we talked about, staffing and training are key provisions of the agreements, as they are in any other agreement. But airports are unique environments. You don't have the same flexibility, especially if a labor union is involved in some of the staffing requirements and other areas where you might in a non-union situation. So it's often a collaboration between the brand and the operator to not only work around staffing, but also supply chain, which is another very, very important area, because you might be working, with an operator, and usually are, that, the success of the business, the profitability hinges upon limiting the number of items that need to be purchased from what we call producers of proprietary products. And so if you're a brand and you have a number of products that need to be purchased from, 50 different suppliers from farms all over the countryside, that cannot be readily procured by an operator at the airport from one of the major food service distributors, it could create some real complexity in the relationship and cost that would be not sustainable or viable. So it's really important to have a collaborative approach with the operator towards supply chain and staffing. Kyle, any thoughts on inspection, audit rights, termination provisions?
I mean, I think termination provisions is a good one that would often be amended from the form. You're going to have to give a little bit more flexibility to terminate based on the RFP, the airport, and sort of when that cycle is set to end. So whereas in a franchise agreement, you often have a set term of, let's say, 10 years. But you're going to have to give some flexibility depending on the situation at the individual airport. So that's one that I would often see negotiated as well.
Great point. And also inspection rights, you're dealing with an airport, and security and badging. So important to work collaboratively with the operator to negotiate the ability to get badging and to visit the location and do quality assurance inspections. And in terms of reporting, different than a standard brick and mortar franchise, most of these operators will have their own POS system for multiple concepts. And
Great point.
So you're going to need to work with them collaboratively on reporting rights. And if you want to get any information beyond just gross sales, talk about different pieces of information that are needed to help the operator be successful. Next slide, please. Go ahead, Kyle.
No, I was just going to say that's another provision that you often see negotiated or amended regarding the POS system and the restrictions around the POS system, because they're not going to be the same sort of restrictions in an airport environment where they're required to use a different POS system.
Great point, Kyle. And I would say, done airport restaurant transactions for going on almost 20 years. We love doing them. We love the operators. We love the brands, and we love good deals. And a good deal means all parties are making money. And so if a brand is, trying to, charge a royalty that's unnaturally higher, put unnatural costs on it, and the operator is losing money, it's not going to work. So we've seen the best results from collaboration, and that's economic transparency from both sides, learning from the operator, what's their occupancy cost? What's the union labor impact on the business if a union's involved? What's the impact of street pricing or whatever pricing scheme is required by the airport? Because it's going to be very different than what operators see at their own franchise or own brick and mortar locations. And so it's really important for the parties to understand the economics of the other, to arrive at the business terms that are going to allow both parties to be successful. Because the last thing we want is an operator to go in and be disappointed by the operation and seeing things that they say, wow, this is really not how I think it should be run. It's not my brand standards. And that goes to point B. Active collaboration is critical. If one expects an operator just to run the restaurant perfectly without active partnership, it's not realistic. The best results come from great collaboration between brands and operators and constant communication and trying to get better. And so it's not a sign the agreement and good luck with it, send me a royalty. It's an ongoing relationship and a partnership. And brands and operators we've seen really appreciate that level of partnership. Flexibility is key, a very different environment than brick and mortar, and being able to work outside of the box of the conventional expectations of street restaurants is critical. And then patience. There are going to be challenges in airport restaurants. Never seen a deal where there haven't been, but we've seen very few deals where operators and brands have said, you know what, we wish we hadn't done it. By and large, almost everybody is looking for more opportunities to work together. So I know we have a couple minutes left here. I guess any questions from the audience while we have some time left? Questions or comments?
Yes, we have a couple in the Q&A box if you want to look at those.
Oh, terrific. Okay. I don't see any in my Q&A box.
Ooh. Do you want me to read them out?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the first one is there any preference among airport authorities these days to select operators who are local, such as non-chain entities who own and operate restaurants in the community in which the airport is located?
That's a great question, and the answer is potentially. There's different approaches taken at each airport. There's certainly been a preference for local brands or local business owner participation. We see a high level of collaboration between operators, sometimes what we call primes, and I think we have some representatives on our call today from some larger and smaller operators where groups work together to get these opportunities. So I would say there continues to be an emphasis on local brands and business involvement, and it depends on a case-by-case basis.
All right, next question. That says, a hypothetical question. I found a great concept for the airport. How do I, a new franchisee, go about securing a site at the airport?
So if this is from the perspective of somebody that does not own the brand but wants to be a franchisee at the airport, that would be most likely getting information from the airport authority to understand when the next concession opportunities are coming up, and then separately working on an arrangement with the brand to be able to represent them in connection with that opportunity, and then to see what they can do to put themselves in the best position for that opportunity, which would likely be an RFP whenever it arises.
All right. The next question. How can a brand limit liability associated with a licensed restaurant that is managed by an operator?
Well, there's a number of ways to limit liability contractually. So the brand is not operating the restaurant, it's licensing the intellectual property. In terms of lawsuits, the brand may often get called into the dispute because those unscrupulous plaintiffs attorneys out there, and apologize to anyone on the call that is one, but they often sue everybody. Yeah, and then there are what's called indemnification provisions in these agreements that will determine who is actually responsible for handling a case. Now, if it's an intellectual property issue, if it's a trademark issue, that's almost always the brand's responsibility to resolve, right? That makes sense. They own the trademark. That's what they're bringing to the platform. But if it's an operational issue, if it's sexual harassment, wrongful termination, food safety issue, these types of things, that's usually the responsibility of the operator. That's also why it's very important to have insurance and making sure the right types of coverages and amounts, EPLI coverage, and those types of things.
Okay, our last one. It says, is it a commonplace for operators to ask for exclusivity from brands? And what is the best approach in respectfully pushing back on this?
Great question. For all operators on the call, we know, yes, you always ask for exclusivity. You know, we've seen some pretty aggressive exclusivity asks, you know, and saying we want to be exclusive not only in a terminal, but at an airport or airports in an entire state or region. Say that's probably pushing a little too far. Exclusivity can work both ways. Sometimes it's actually better for a brand to go exclusive and not dilute their brand across multiple parties. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes, you know, it's better to be potentially being proposed by multiple parties. So it's always a negotiation, and it's really fact dependent. The norm, you know, for most operators, they're going to want a brand to be exclusive in an RFP. That's the norm. That's the rule, not the exception. If they're going to spend the money and time putting together RFP materials, going out to the airport for the opportunity, they are going to want to make sure that the brands they have in their portfolio are not working with anybody else. But there are exceptions. They are limited, and it is on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes there's brands that, you know, are just so broad appeal, you know, and have so much strength and leverage that they negotiate that. And then there's other circumstances where other operators are willing to allow folks to go with more than one party. But a really important area for thought and discussion in any airport negotiation. Any wrap-up points, Kyle?
It's amazing. That was perfect.
Well, hey,
Been a pleasure. Been a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. Really appreciate you spending a little more than 30 minutes with us. If you have franchising needs or any interest in airports, obviously you can reach out anytime. We look forward to any topics you might have for our next 30 Minutes Essentials. So feel free to send those our way. And we hope you have a great rest of the week. Thank you again.